Right, hello there, everyone. I think you're all just getting connected to the audio at the moment. I'm Nim. I work as a project manager for the Forth Rivers Trust, and it's lovely to have so many of you want to come along to our RiverLife Chit Chat. So I work as project manager for the RiverLife project, which works on river restoration on the Almond and Avon River in West Lothian. But I understand that we have people from all over the UK come and join us today. So we actually have this our final talk in our mini series of Chit Chats. And we are delighted to have with us Amy and Micah, who run Stoneheap Woodlands out in West Lothian in an area called Stoneyburn. And they do volunteering and teaching about coppicing and woodland management there. And they've had that woodland now, they were just telling me, since 2011, so just coming up a decade. So they've really gotten to know their land and have a good understanding of it. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to Amy and Micah. Oh, no, sorry, I've got some basic things. Questions. We've got quite a lot of us tonight. So normally I say if we have more than 10 of us, then I encourage you to write questions in the chat and introduce yourself in the chat as well, so we know where people are from. And if you have questions, write them down in the chat. I will keep a log of them. And just so we don't have the issue of lots of feedback and noise from people chipping in, then I will read out those questions as we go through. And I think we're in for quite an interesting chat tonight. I'm certainly looking forward to it. I was just explaining that I went a bit mad and ordered lots of really great books on coppicing over the Christmas. So I spent my Christmas and New Year reading all about sorts of mad ancient tools and such. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this tonight as well.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Nim.
All right, hello, I'm Micah and this is Amy, and welcome to the Coppicing talk. So what we're going to try and cover this evening in an hour is what is coppicing, how you do it, why you would do it, when, which also covers a little bit about the history of coppicing, what you could make out of what you've cut down, and then where you could go to next in this brief chat. Okay, so I'm going to introduce, this is Amy, my wife, and she's a professional gardener. She runs a gardening business in our hometown, and she's also an amateur naturalist. She's always been interested in wildlife, particularly plants. Anytime we go walking, she's always naming all the plants that she can see. One of our hobbies we share is historical reenactment. And so she does quite a lot of natural using plants and natural dyeing. Recently, we've been interested in foraging, using plants for either medicinal purposes or for food.
Okay, and so this is Micah, who I met and who trained with me at the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. Micah specialised in arboriculture, and he developed his interest in woodland management, and it then became more of ancient woodlands, didn't it? Mm-hmm. As a kid, he's learnt woodworking from his dad, who was a skilled woodworker, and he uses these techniques today to do his greenworking, which is an old method of using wood straight from the tree. More recently, he started working with people using nature, and in particular woods, as a setting and catalyst for personal development. So so Nim's talked about some of the questions. If you've got questions as you go along, we'll try and make pauses, so if there is any, then we can answer them as we go. Otherwise we'll take them all at the end. Okay, so
cool. So what we're going to do then, we're going to start with the what is coppicing, and if you get any books on coppicing, you'll find there's 3 terms being used. There will be coppicing, pollarding, and coppice with standards. So if we look at the first one, which is coppicing, simply is a pruning technique for trees and shrubs.
Okay.
You know, whether they be native or non-native, and it mimics nature. So a lot of our native, particularly native broadleaf trees, have evolved that when they get nibbled by animals, they just regrow. Okay, or if they're hit by really hard winters, they'll just reshoot. And so what you're relying on is the plant's natural regenerating properties. And as I said, it applies to most of our native trees and also a lot of imported trees and shrubs that we use in gardens, towns, and general landscapes. So what we've got here, we've got a few slides to show you this sort of process of how it works.
I'm going to have to, there we go. Make this works. This will be interesting. Can you see this? Yeah.
So we have that problem where we're just seeing your file thing rather
Okay.
than the illustration.
So how do I more and share? I've got optimized screen and shared computer sound.
Yeah. But we've just got, at the moment, you can just see all of your different numbered files and file share.
Right, okay.
Rather than the picture.
Now how am I going to get this? Share? No.
So if you pause the
I might have to share again.
and then go back in again, yeah.
Does that do it?
Hang on, just starting up. Yeah, there we go. Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so what we've got here, this is an illustration over 3 years of coppicing. So we've got on the left-hand side, we've got our mature shrub. So in a woodland setting, this could be a hazel, or in a garden, it could be a Philadelphus. And we've cut it hard to the ground in the winter when the plant is dormant. And then during the first season, we get these new shoots. So the hazel, these could be up to 1 meter high. And in the second year, it's starting to grow bigger. So if you leave that for a few years, it'll get back to the original size plant.
Okay. Yeah. The next.
And so this is sort of in the real life. This is a hazel stump. So this is what happens if you have coppers to plant over several generations. So this is ash that's been coppiced in the winter just after Christmas.
Okay.
And then you can see the new shoots coming away from the stump. And this is about a year old. This is not an ash tree, by the way, but this is about a year's growth. And then this is when you're going to start thinking about cutting again. So this is hazel after 8 years of growth. So you've got the whole cycle on the go there.
So this is going to be the fun bit, because we're going to show you a video of how to coppice. And I probably need to come out of this again. And this will be fun, right? Let's see. Let's go down to the first one. No, can you see that?
Okay, welcome to Stoneheap Woods.
Does that work?
An area of hazel that we...
So we just have the bit where it's your file share again folder,
Okay.
rather than
Hang on.
video.
How do I get at this?
90. Yeah.
Stop share. And then screen, where is it? Not that one. Right, okay.
Okay, welcome to Stoneheap Woods.
Still your file share. I did practice this earlier, guys. I do apologise. Amy and Micah are, bless them, very, very nervous about doing this because they're very much hands-on teachers.
Does this work now?
Okay.
That's perfect, yeah.
Welcome to Stoneheap Wood. This is an area of hazel that we coppiced back in 2013. The trees were planted in 1996, 1998. Okay, and how we did that, we used a chainsaw, and you can see the old stump here. And what we've done, we've put slope and cuts on our stump so the water runs off, so we don't get decay in the stump. And we're cutting it as close to the ground as possible. This helps you get nice straight stems, which are ideal for either basket work or for hurdles, for hazel hurdles. The problem we've got here is this has been this stump has been was recut in 2019, and so this is 1 year's growth, and it's about 1 meter high. And the problem we've got here is the deer, if it's not deer fenced, if we haven't got any deer protection, the deer will eat it. So what we're going to do, because we're going to cut this area this winter, is we're going to try a different technique, and I'm going to show you that technique next. Okay, so what I was going to show you is we're going to coppice this hazel using the braised nose wood technique. So I've got a length of stick here which is 0.8 meters long, and that will give me the height of the cut. All right, the idea of cutting so high rather than at ground level is it should help with stopping the deer eating the new shoots. All right, and so all I'm doing, because a lot of this is quite small, I can just cut it with sharp loppers. The important thing is all your tools are pretty sharp. And if you're a little bit above the stick, it doesn't matter that much. Right. Okay, so we've got a thicker stem here, so I want to cut that. What I'm really careful that we're worried about is not damaging the bark. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut a bit higher. So what I'm doing is going to fall that way towards the camera. So I'm doing what I call a relieving cut on that side of the stem, and then I do a felon cut just a little bit above it. I can support the weight of the stem, and that gets some of the weight off the branch. And then what I can then do is then prune off the final cut. If it's quite, the branch is not too thick, you can, if you can support the weight of it, cut all the way through in one cut. But as you can see, as it moves, it is a little tricky to keep that bark from tearing. Slope, so you end up with these slope cuts, no torn bark, so you don't get any disease and you'll get good regeneration. Okay, so this is a stool we cut earlier, just like Blue Peter, and what I've done is all been cut at 0.8 meters, and all the brash has gone into the dead hedge behind you. That makes really good habitat. What we're hoping from here is when we get the new shoots in the spring, that they'll be high enough that the deer don't eat them. We minimise the amount of deer browse on them.
Okay. I hope you heard all of that. some of the audio was
experimental, so to speak. What we're talking about, the braised nose wood technique, is that they in braised nose wood in Oxford, they tried different techniques, different heights of cut for coppicing to see how much it was affected by deer, and they found that 0.8 meters was the optimum height to cut. If you cut at ground level, loads gets munched. If you cut at 1.2 meters, which is more towards pollarding, then you tend to shade the ground out too quickly, so you lose a lot of your ground flora. So they were doing it more for habitat reasons. Okay. All right. So what are we looking at?
Woodland management.
Yeah, so woodland management. So that was more of a pruning technique we were talking about there. The other thing that coppicing comes in is a woodland management technique, and it's a really ancient form of land management for our broad native broadleaf trees. So we're just going to show you. Here we go. Okay, so this is my favorite wood. I know we've got folks from all over the place tonight. If you're from Norfolk or Suffolk, go on pilgrimage to this wood. This is Bradfield Wood in Suffolk near Bury St Edmunds, and what you're looking at here is a ancient ash stool, ash coppice, and they reckon this is probably clocking 700-800 years old. Certainly there's records of this wood going back to 1300, and so you get this big stump, and the limbs still coming off are still, you know, sort of like 20 years old there. All right, and what they do in a woodland case is you divide the woodland up into areas. Josh shows yeah. All right, so these have got different names depending on what part of Britain you come from. So they can be called panels, cants, coops, or hags or hacks. Up here, hacks maybe come from sort of Viking word, not sure. And this is a drawing of our wood. So we looked at Stoneheap Wood. We wanted to manage it by Coppicing technique. And so you can see you have got up to 28 areas here. And the numbers on it basically gives you the years. So we were looking at a 28-year cycle over this wood, because we weren't sure on how quickly the plants regenerate and what sort of growth we've got. We realize now that we can do it on a much shorter cycle. So we're probably looking at half of that, maybe 12 to 14 years. All right, so you basically cut in each area in rotation. So cut area 1, 12 years later, you're cutting it again. All right. Okay. So the next term I'd like to chat about.
I'll see if there are any questions.
Do you have any questions about that?
And go. Was there any questions so far on any of?
So we do have a few questions actually. Yeah. So the first one is from Maria, and she asked, I have a hazel at the top of my garden. I cut mine much higher than you showed. Is this bad for the tree?
Not what, to be tall?
To cut it back.
Oh no, if you cut it back, so the stuff we were cutting back in the wood was 20 years old. So it was a good bit taller than what you saw on the video. And it's grown back quite healthily, no problem at all.
Okay, great. And she's asked whether if she's cut it a bit taller than you showed, would that be any difference? But I suspect we'll come on to that when we cover pollarding.
Oh, so she's actually, it's not that the plant was huge, it's she's cut it back roughly where we've cut it, maybe a bit higher.
Yeah.
Well, this is the experiment that we're trying this year. But what happened at Brasenose was that they discovered it when they cut it back to 1.2 meters higher, which is higher than 40 centimeters higher than what we've cut it, that it grew back and shaded out the ground flora much faster. So because they were doing it as a biodiversity, as a habitat, that wasn't as good for them. So if she's doing it in her garden, she may not, depending what she's got growing underneath it, that may not be an issue.
So not bad
to grow back, but
yeah.
So not bad for tree, but potentially bad for other plants, depending on what your setup is. Excellent. Yeah. Okay. And I've got another question from Levi, and Levi says, does the Brasenose technique have any other different factors to others? So other than the height, is there anything else that differs?
Not really, no.
Just height.
It's the height, yeah, because it was a research article we found, and it was what they were doing before is they were coppicing it right to the ground, right to stumps, and they were getting so much deer damage that they thought, well, we need to try something different, and they didn't want to put deer fencing around the wood. And like our wood has got a lot, people walk through the wood, there is rights of way, but they walk through the wood. As soon as you start putting deer fencing in, it's quite intrusive, and it's very expensive as well.
It's also not great for wildlife as well. We're talking about biodiversity, because it does cut off path access for things. And by just because they're not in your woodland doesn't mean that they're not in another native woodland eating there instead. So it's as not fracturing habitats is one of my favorite things to do. Cool. So we have another question as well from Anissa. Anissa asks, can I coppice a wild cherry tree in my garden? It's only a sapling at the moment.
Yes.
There we go. Nice easy one, that, isn't it?
Yeah, most natives you can. There's only a few. The only stuff I've seen on native trees is things like birches. You can coppice them, but you tend to shorten their life, which is interesting because like that old ash tree I showed you, ashes don't normally live for that long. They probably live for like 300 years or tops. So pollard coppicing that has actually extended its life.
Yeah.
But with birch it doesn't, so you're limited on what you can do with it. But your cherry you'll be fine.
That's great. Okay, so I've got another question from Alan, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right there. Is there any other information about the braised nose technique and possible research and methodology? And I guess we're going to have a few questions about this. So is there any chance that you could dig out that research paper and I can share it around with everyone after this
Yeah,
talk?
we'll try and do that, because that's what we want.
Yeah, definitely.
We have got a pile of books to show you at the end. Also, we realised, we could send you, some people may not be interested in that sort of amount of information, but we can certainly share it with you, no problem at all.
Well, I'm certainly interested in that amount of information, so I would love that research article, so that'd be great. And then I've got another question from David, and he's a really good question, actually. He says, how is ash dieback affecting coppice stalls, such as the ash that you showed us?
I don't know what's happening down Bradfield Wood way, but I've certainly noticed in our wood, if you coppice ash, you'll kill it.
It'll die faster.
It'll die faster because if you think about it, how plants work is so much of their energy has gone into growing, so much of their energy is into reproduction, and so much into protection, into defense. Is that when you've cut a tree really hard, it says, right, I need to grow loads more branches because I need leaves, because I need to make some sugar. And when it's doing that, its defenses are down. So it's more at risk of catching diseases. So we've stopped any ash tree we've got in the wood, we're not cutting at all.
Okay, so if you are in an ash dieback area, then what you want to do is not be stressing your trees out, just let them be.
Exactly,
And ash, have very forgiving, they're late into the spring anyway, so if you're trying to manage for ground biodiversity, then they're not one of the trees that you're going to massively have issues with, I guess, because they do have quite a lot of ephemeral flora. And one last question from Kerry here, who asks, do you know if eucalyptus can coppice?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
you've got to be careful. The only thing it's interesting that because it's something we were going to cover a little bit in about doing it in your garden, because we realise a lot of people don't own a wood, but they may own a garden. Is that we have two clients we need to coppice their eucalyptus, but we'll need to do it when the weather is a bit warmer.
Yeah.
Because it's a tree that doesn't normally have a foot of snow, so you can't do it now. Traditionally, we've been coppicing now in the snow, so you can't do that with eucalyptus. You're gonna have to leave it a bit, but you can do it.
Yeah, later in March, early April, we'll give it a hack, and that should be fine. Okay, so that leads us on to the next bit.
What's that? Pollarding. Chat about pollarding.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So pollarding is really simple. It's coppicing on a stick. So instead of cutting off at ground level, you're cutting a lot much higher. So do you want to show that pollard?
Oh,
look. It's back to the technology again.
Gold. Right, okay. And we're going to the photos, yeah?
Yeah.
So, there we go.
Here we go. Okay, so this is a pollard tree at Bradfield Wood. And traditionally in the old medieval woods, they're grown on the edge of the wood as boundary trees, and they were cut high so that the animals couldn't eat the new shoots coming off the tree, particularly livestock, particularly cattle. So so what you'll notice about that is you've got quite a thick stem and then quite thin, relatively thin branches on top of her. And then so this is one that's been cut. So this will be done in the winter. So all the branches are cut off, and you've got these this regeneration of new shoots coming along there. There is some evidence they've looked at is that this pollarding as well as coppicing can extend the life of the tree. So this is an old. It's gone. It's obviously been left for a long time now, but this is an old oak in Norfolk that was originally a pollard tree. Okay, and how you do that? We're going to show you a wee video.
Another share of a video. Apologies for the sound again. Let's see.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is some willow pollards. We cut these and we use these in art projects or groups, and it's very much like your coppicing. The only difference is that you'll cut a lot more frequent cycle. These often get cut every year or maybe up to 3 years. And the trick with it is you're always cutting back to your old wounds. Yeah, you're not cutting below them. If you cut below them, the tree has then got to work really hard to try and seal that wound from disease. So you cut back to these old, and you cut as cleanly as you can.
Okay.
All right, so what I'm going to do a bit of pruning on this willow. This stem here is rubbing right through the whole pollard top, so I'm just going to cut that one out. And then what I'm doing is getting as close to those old wounds as I can without cutting into them, and I'm neatly pulling them off. Sometimes the really small ones, you may need a pair of secateurs. You can see this one, you might be able to see this a little bit easier. Sometimes some of this growth here, this bent one, this has been broken, probably by the wind. It's removed stuff like that. So that will be a source of infection. Okay, so quite a quick process, and this is producing willow. It's a bit rough for basket making, but certainly art projects and things like that is really suitable.
Okay, and so the last term we're going to look at is coppice with standards. And this is the really old technique of coppicing, whereas as well as the stuff you're coppicing in the cycle, you've got mature trees growing up through it. So we've got a couple of slides to show you on that. Here we go. Okay, so this is Wayland wood, named after the Saxon god of blacksmithing. And you can see this area has recently been coppiced. The ground is quite clear. You can see a lot of coppice in the background, and you've got these big mature oaks growing through the area. And the idea of this is you have so many trees per acre that you're growing on, and they'll go from a year old all the way through to 120 years old. And this is where your timbers are going to come out for those for your building projects and things like that.
Okay.
And so what they'll do is they'll do next one. So here again, what they've done is they've thinned some of these standards out, and you'll see there's some big stumps there. Is what they'll do, they'll become new copper stumps. So you'll get some new growth coming off those. But now what they'll do with some of them is they'll what they call singling. So they'll be looking at, they get a copper stump and selecting one of the stems to grow on as a new tree to keep this sustainable supply of big timber. So what we've got is we've got a wee video about what singling is.
Okay. There we go.
Okay, so with coppicing standards, when you remove the bigger standards, you're going to need a new one. So the process you use is called singling. So you look at a copper stump, this is cherry plum, and what we're going to do is single this to one stem. So what we do is find the best stem that looks pretty straight and make a good standard tree. So I'll be looking at this one in here, nice and straight, not branching too early. So hopefully that'll grow straight and get a nice standard tree out of it. And then what I would do is cut all the rest of the stems around it from this stump to the ground, right to the ground. So all the energy from that copper stump goes into this one stem.
Oh, stop share. Okay, there you go.
Okay, all right. So there's your three terms. So now with the next section we're going to go on is to why you would do it, and Amy's going to talk about why you would do it in a garden.
Yeah. Okay, it was just briefly to talk a little bit. We've mentioned garden plants already from some of the questions as well, like eucalyptus. So there's a reason why you would coppice a eucalyptus, and that's because the juvenile foliage is quite round and a lot more attractive than the mature foliage. So if you keep coppicing it, you're going to keep reproducing this juvenile foliage, which is attractive in a garden setting. So that's one reason you would do coppicing in a garden. Stooling is another term that is probably more used in a garden. And there's another reason that you do it, and that is for the size and shape, to keep a plant which would normally be far too large for that size of garden within bounds, so that it can still be grown and doesn't actually outgrow its space. I've got a picture here of classic example. There we go, and they are pollarded lime trees. So obviously left to grow, these would form a small wood in this garden, but if these are kept pollarded, usually cut back every 3 years. It's a technique that's used really frequently in France. Actually, they do very well there, but it's also used here, and it's done properly. This is absolutely fine. Okay, and you get these sort of stumps with new shoots coming away on them. And the other plant we've got here, another example, is the cornus. That's me. And this is grown for the winter red stems, so it's really attractive. But to keep the red stems, to keep reproducing these red stems, you would need to cut these back either every year or every 2 or 3 years anyway, to small pegs in the ground, so just above ground level. So there's some examples of coppicing and pollarding in a garden setting. I don't know if we've got any more questions come up.
So we do. We have a few. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Wendy, and I love this question. She says, do you have dormice in your wood, and does the coppicing affect their food source?
I'm afraid we don't have dormice. I'd love to. I think that's something that, no, we don't have dormice. So it's not something we've had any experience of.
No, we do.
But they are
have
connected with coppicing down south in England. That's where
we do have small furry creatures in the wood, because you can see the holes around, and the dogs go after them, but we haven't actually seen what they are. Yeah, we think there might be voles,
but they're not dormice, sorry.
Yeah,
sounds like you guys got voles. Yeah. Yeah, but no, dormice are a massive rarity, if not at all, in Scotland, I believe. So yeah, sadly, that's one for English coppicers, something that we don't have to think about up here. But vole protection is something that we definitely have to think about in Scotland for establishing young trees, because they do like to strip all the bark off young trees when we put them in, particularly aspen. We've had real issues with aspen in some of our planting. And we've got another question from one of my fellows at SIUC, so the Agricultural College in Edinburgh. Says, what height does a coppice become a pollard, and is there a defined point? Which I think is one of those brilliantly specific questions that only a student could ask.
How long's a piece of string, isn't it? It's interesting, because I remember going, it's actually for our honeymoon, we went to Mens, which is in the French Alps, and there was a crew out pollard and street trees, and they were as tall as the houses. So, and how short they are, well, I've seen pollards in Norfolk, they're only like 3 foot high. So, and I think it's probably where, but they're on a bank near a ditch, and I think there are probably a lot of them there that the new stems will cut off probably traditionally as forage for animals.
Yeah, so you could ask that question having seen the Brasenose technique and go, well, is that actually pollarding on a small stick? So
Is that, yeah.
Could be.
Excellent. Okay, and then I've got a question from Liz, and she says, what's the benefit of pollarding over the other types of cut that you've shown?
The benefit is really the height, is that you gain the height. So with those lime trees in that garden, you've still got big trees in your garden, but you're not losing the shade, and you're not concerned about any a lot of people, I've been an arborist for years. A lot of people always worry if they've got a big tree, will it blow over? Will it damage my jag? That's the sort of bottom line of it. Will it damage my new conservatory? So you're getting that structure in the garden, which is nice because you're getting some height in it, but you're not getting that risk factor. And also, especially in the spring, you get the new shoots on these trees can be nice and bright as well, so they're decorative too.
Well, if you've got space, let it grow into a tree. By the way, you don't have to pollard everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for instance, I do pollarding and coppicing where I am, mainly because I also have bees. So I quite like them being able to not have to they particularly like it when they've got quite a condensed shrub. So I have some Telia that I keep pollarded, and they love that because they just have a big ball of nectar that they can go to. And yeah, certainly in a garden where I am, I'm on a slope, I'm trying to make the best use of my light. And so this is really a technique that I use for just, actually just having a variety and a good biodiversity of species, about kind of having a woodland effectively.
That's right. Yeah. Okay.
And we've got another question as well from Hannah, and it's quite a long question. I think it has one of those ones which has got a few questions in. So if one of the main aims of coppicing is to extend the life of a tree, how is this achieved with high browsing pressure from deer? Isn't this condemning trees to a stunted, long-lived versions rather than more established trees that will live a shorter lifespan?
Good question. It's like, I suppose the reason
why you
why you're coppicing or why you're managing trees
in the first place
is for human use mostly.
Yeah.
It's,
and I think that's...
if we walked away, the trees would just grow and they become mature, and if they're shaded out by invasives, then they die. It's competition, away you go, but then you'd have a lot more woodland all over Britain anyway, because there wouldn't be any sheep floating about eating everything that moves. Deer would find their natural balance. Yeah, so a lot of it is us is the problem of it. Yeah.
And I think there's that question that we need to ask ourselves when we're planting trees, rather than letting them generate naturally and go through their natural life course. And that's not just the right tree for the right place, but the right management technique for the right tree as well. I see so many people plant eucalyptuses next to their house, and then 30 years later they're like, oh, this is massive. And I'm like, well, why didn't you manage it? For instance, someone was complaining at me for coppicing an ash that lives underneath one of our telephone poles, and the reason I coppice it is because it'll otherwise take out my neighbour's telephone.
So it's looking at why, because when you look at why, pollarding and coppicing is not always the answer. It is just an option.
It's one management option. And it's also, how do you know how the plant is it, if it lives for 1,000 years, is that a bad thing or a good thing? I think that's, making moral judgments about something that we don't know who makes moral judgments. Like yew trees live for 3,000 years and they naturally coppice, they naturally rot out and then regenerate. It's a natural, and they'll just keep going as long as we don't come along and put seats inside them because we think it's a nice idea, and that stops their natural regeneration going on. It's finding the balance,
Okay. And I've got another question as well. Sorry, there are quite a few. One from Alex again, and he asks, are there any woodlands in Britain where coppicing or pollarding has been stopped in order to create diversity of woodland habitat and structure that you know of?
Don't know of any.
Don't know. It's actually we will go out. We are going to go into history of it. One reason that the two woods we showed slides of, Bradfield Wood and Wayland Wood, the main reason they have this management form there is for biodiversity. It's not for the wood. It's not for the produce. It's for the product. Because quite frankly, unless you've got really big mature hardwoods, the wood is not that high a value. You can sell it as firewood. We'll talk about products later, but it's not high value. It's because of it suits so many plants. Like Bradfield wood was not coppiced for some of its life in the 20th century, and then when they went and cut back sections, the species they found 200 species they hadn't seen for years.
I mean, I was going to say,
they've been sitting there waiting for that cycle to be put back in. So it is a reason why, it's continued. There is issues where we've lost biodiversity, particularly in the 20th century, where old coppice woods were viewed as old hat and not producing the timber that we want for modern Britain. So the trees were grubbed out, and things like Sitka spruce and exotics, particularly conifers, were planted instead. They became plantations, and the biodiversity dropped. So it's usually the other way round, I would say, rather than, stopping it because of it's ruining biodiversity.
Yeah, I'd say from my experience, I've certainly never heard of anywhere that coppicing was stopped. That sort of management technique was stopped in order to create biodiversity. I've heard it in lots of other ways where there's been a desperate attempt to try and get some sort of community or some sort of business in to manage what was an old coppice in order to bring back the declining species diversity that's in there. So that's the other side of it. Yeah. And then we've got one last question before we crack on to the next bit, which is a fairly straightforward question. At what age do you start coppicing, and what's the frequency that you do it at?
Young.
Great.
Really young. Because they're into that habit straight away. Usually it's you'll wait until the plant establishes itself. So that could take 3 years, and then you're into that cycle. The same with a pollard as well. So you get the tree established. And we're normally in this, because it's usually in a woodland that you're doing a lot of this sort of management technique, is you're planting quite young trees. They're only probably a year old when you plant them. You're looking at young stuff because it establishes a lot better than putting big old trees in the ground like you see in streets and stuff. And also it's quite young when you're putting it in, but early on. And then the cycle really depends on what you're going to use it for. Yeah,
that makes sense. Thanks, guys. I'll let you crack on with the next bit.
Thank you.
Okay, so back to the why. So why would you use it as a management technique in woods? Well, there's 4 reasons really. The first one is sustainable, because you're not cutting all the wood down in one lump. It's not like you're going into say a Sitka plantation where you tend to clear fell it and then restock it. Is you're cutting an area of the wood each year, and depend on the wood, there can be several sections of it. It's really low impact. You're not using huge harvesting machinery to do it. A lot of the timber you're taking out is only sort of 10 centimeters, 4 inches wide. So if you're like a community wood or something like that, you can use a lot by hand tools or chainsaws, and you can use a lot of volunteer labor as well. So you can get your community involved in their woodland. The reason why one thing that's really good about not having heavy machinery inside is you don't get so much soil disturbance, which can then, if you wreck the soil structure, you can then disturb the ground floor of what's going on underneath your plants, underneath your trees. It's also what we've just been talking about. You'll also maintain a historic landscape. So if you've got these ancient coppice woods that are like 1,000 years old, you're maintaining that because they've been there so long. They have now become really biodiverse, and they're often what we call triple SIs, which is sites of special scientific interest, because they've attracted certain species that only live, maybe only endemic to that wood. So if you change the management structure of that wood, you can then they lose their habitat. And then the 4th reason, which Amy's going to carry on and talk about, is it encourages biodiversity.
Yeah. So where there's been coppicing, like what we've been saying, it's important to carry that tradition on because it gives stability for the flora and fauna that live within that wood. So it's important to maintain that. We've got a slightly different case at Stoneheap Wood in that it was planted in the mid 1990s. So we've effectively got a plantation, and the ground flora and the fauna is still evolving. It does take decades, it does take a long time for this. So we're at a very early stage. The wood's only about 25 years old, but it was when we bought it, it's has a single age structure because it was all planted at the same time. So coppicing was used to provide diversity in this structure, so it would become more attractive to a wider range of plants and animals. It provides a wider range of habitat. It also provides a rhythm. So you find as you have the coppice cycle moving around the wood, there's this rhythm which is followed by the ground vegetation and associated animals and birds and invertebrates as they follow that coppicing pattern around the wood. So looking at this range of wildlife, I thought I'd focus in a little bit on different aspects of them. So the first one I was going to look at was the ground vegetation, and this is going to be quite brief. So the ground vegetation, I'll just share a picture. Where are we going here? That's go there. So there we are. That's a newly coppiced area. It looks quite dramatic, and in fact it's the light levels which are the most dramatic change that you see in its first year of having been cut back. But this is when the ground vegetation really takes off. It peaks in its sort of the second to third year after you've coppiced. So these are plants which have just been surviving vegetatively underneath the coppice plants while they've been growing up, and they've shaded most of the growth out. So they don't necessarily flower, they're just surviving in a vegetative state. Or it's seed that's still sitting in the ground, or it's plants that have moved in from the edges. So what you see here is a result of how we've been managing the wood, and actually how this ground has been managed before there was a wood here, because it is so recent. And so a lot of the plants are of semi-improved agricultural land, like buttercup, docks and nettles, and only slowly will this pattern shift to more woodland plants over time. We have tried planting some native plants that we know are native to this area specifically, and I've tried growing ones from seed from local seed companies that provenance in Scotland, so to make sure it is actually suitable for this site. But we have another problem here which we've already talked about a few times, because that's why we're using the technique, and that is the deer. So what you see growing in the wood on the ground is a result of not just how it's being managed by us, but it's also how it's being managed by the wildlife, namely the deer. So a lot of the plants you see growing are what the deer do not eat. So here we have honeysuckle, which we've been planting in amongst the hazel coop to grow up the stems to produce the nice twisty stems to cut for interesting walking sticks. There's one here which has been left to grow beyond walking stick stage, but you can see the twist in it that's been formed by the honeysuckle growing around it. So the great thing with this is it produces these lovely twisty stems. You've got lovely flowers which are attractive to moths and certain butterflies, and the deer are not eating it, so that's exciting. And there's another plant here which is the primula. This is the native primula, which we've discovered that the deer don't eat, and we've been planting it like mad around the coppice woodlands, and they come into their own, particularly when we start cutting back. They really start to flower away again, and they're really attractive as well for people walking around the wood, which we have a lot of people walking around the wood, and it makes it more attractive. People enjoy it, and that's another aspect of the woodland as well, is people coming in and enjoying it as an amenity resource as well, and appreciating what we've got there. So going on from the ground vegetation, the invertebrates which are little creepy crawly insects, the beetles and whatnot. The response to coppicing is not that well known, but it does appear to increase in the first 2 to 5 years. That's when they peak, due to the fact you've opened this area up. There's much more light, and you've created like a warm microclimate. They quite like that. So you do get larger numbers of ground beetles and spiders coming in. They can be quite specific to certain conditions or even types of plant. So the wider the range of plants you've got growing there, so it's not all just hazel, the better. So the wider the range of habitats, plants that are going to be there for certain species. So that's looking at the invertebrates generally. I was also going to mention butterflies and moths more specifically, because they seem to be more attractive. Because it's known that woodland provides for more species of butterfly than any other type of habitat. So in the more southern parts of Britain, where coppicing has declined, so have some of the species of butterfly. So we were talking earlier about whether coppicing's been stopped, but actually where coppicing has stopped, you've seen a decline, and it has been recorded. And this is for the heath fritillary, where numbers have dropped. There's other fritillaries that do well in coppice woodlands, but it's the heath fritillary in the south of England which has definitely dropped in number because of the reduction in coppicing. So in Scotland, where there's not such a massive area of coppicing, it's still an important habitat nonetheless. So we do have a wide range of plants growing at Stoneheap Wood that we've coppiced, and this produces quite a good range of habitats for them. I'm going to lose my place here for a minute. So they like the open sunny areas, and they particularly like the grasses that come up. The grasses provide food for the larvae and of quite a few butterflies. So this is really important. So you can imagine this peak, if it peaks in the first 2 to 5 years, that's when you're going to get a peak of butterfly activity as well. Some larvae of butterflies and moths actually will eat young trees. So having that range of age and structure is quite important in terms of for the larvae. So you get a wider range of larvae if you've got wider range of plants in different stages of growth. So I've got a picture here, not of a butterfly, because it's the wrong time of year to be finding these. So oh, that was the invertebrate that I was meant to show you. Here we go.
Do you want to talk about that?
Do I want to talk about it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Right, so that was the hawker. This is a common hawker. Now, the important thing about this is the larvae like still pools of water, which we have plenty of around the wood. And coppicing produces a nice small open site with a warmer microclimate, and the adult common hawkers will come and fly in and then sun themselves on the stacks of wood that we have placed around the coops. So we have noticed quite an increase in these numbers over the last 10 years as we've been doing more of the coppicing. So that is fantastic. That's probably about 4 inches wide. It's quite a sight when you see it. And then we move on to this is a bird cherry, which is into its probably 5th or 6th year, and it has attracted its bird cherry ermine moth, a very specific ermine moth that likes the bird cherry, and it's produced all this webbing. The larvae has actually turned into an adult at this point, because I couldn't find it, but I definitely found the webbing it produced. So this is an example of an invertebrate that has a very specific food source, and by coppicing we've actually given it something to survive on and increased its number, which is great. So moving on from the invertebrates, I wanted to have a quick look at the birds and the impact of coppicing with birds. Now, birds tend not to be so, not all of them, but they're not so specific to specific trees, but they're more, it's more about the structure. So when you have a very open coppice, when it's been recently coppiced, the range of birds that you would find would include tree pipits, yellowhammers, linnets, and whitethroats in its first 3 to 4 years, where it's quite open still. As you get more canopy closure of between year 4 and year 10, you're more likely to find the willow warbler, which we do have, blackcaps, chiffchaffs we also have, and wrens, which we have as well at its peak. And as the trees become more mature, you get the more woodlandy range of birds, including robins, blackbirds, chaffinches, great tits, and blue tits, and the wren. We have all of those in number. And where you get more standard trees, you get the woodpecker, which we also have, and tree creepers, which we have in the wood. So you get slightly different ranges of birds, depending on what structure you've got growing in there. So unfortunately, I'm not very good at photographing birds, but I do have a lovely picture of a piece of stone with shells next to it, dead giveaway, and this is a thrush anvil that we discovered on the floor of the it's about a 10-year-old section of coop, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Where the ground vegetation, as you can see, is quite restricted. The light levels are quite limited. So you can see clearly here how little vegetation there is, but it's obviously created a nice space here for the thrush to come in and claim its stone, which it will return to many times to eat its prey. Okay, and a quick mention of the cuddly small mammals. We did talk a little bit about the mammals earlier when we mentioned that we don't have dormice, but we do have voles, we have wood mice, and there's other small creatures like shrews that you might find. I think it's voles that we have, and the numbers are meant to increase in the first 2 to 3 years. And we have other animals in association like buzzards that come in and look for these small voles, which is quite interesting. You get the whole food chain going on. It's great.
Because that was the thing about the dormouse, was that they were managing coppice woods in southern England to protect dormouse.
Yeah.
To give them habitat.
Yeah.
So it was part of that.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So as well as the different creatures, I was just going to have a quick mention of rotation lengths and the impact on biodiversity. So from what I've just described, you can see in the first, you get a peak of ground vegetation, which is great for the insects and butterflies and moths in the first 1 to 3 years, whereas birds prefer the scrubby thickets. They peak, a lot of them peak at 4 to 10 years. So a rotation of 10 to 12 years will work best for biodiversity, but this is quite labor intensive. If you have longer cycles, you'll get more fungi, moss, lichen, slugs, and moths growing in it. The size of each coop that you cut is quite important. You really want to aim at a small site of 0.5 to 1 hectare per year, which is best, and that works well more for butterflies anyway. But if you have it too small, you'll get a lot of shading out from the edges, and you may well get excessive deer damage. Oh, by the way, the birds prefer slightly larger areas. And the shape as well, even though the picture we showed you had lots of square boxes on it, on the ground, it's quite wriggly. The edges are quite indented, so you get more edge area, which is provides more habitat. And when we talk about the edges, when we coppice, a lot of the brush is put around the edge in what we call our dead hedges. I've got a nice picture of a dead hedge. So this is how we protect the coops when we were coppicing right to the ground. And in fact, we're still doing it, even though we're using this new technique. We put all the brush around the edges, and we stack it up to about 6 foot high. And the idea behind it provides a barrier for the roe deer If they can't see over it, then they won't jump over it. That's the theory. So it needs to be over 1.2 meters high. So 6 foot's quite good, because it will drop quite quickly over time. So the idea is that by the time the deer start jumping over it, which they will do eventually when they can see over it, that the new growth on the coppice has got beyond the point that the deer can do too much damage to it. So, but it also provides a habitat around the edge, because as this wood drops and it rots, you've got a habitat for fungi, you've got beetles growing in it. I've got a nice picture of, this is hair ice on dead wood. So this is a particular sort of fungi that we have at the wood called Exidiopsis effusa. And when it freezes, because it's quite a moist wood, and when it freezes, it produces this beautiful fairy ice or hair ice. It looks like snow. And another fungi, which we're really excited about because we've just discovered it today. So this is a first for Stoneheap wood. This just shows you it is turning into a proper wood now. And this is the scarlet elf cup fungi, which the habitat of which is dead wood, in particular hazel. And this is actually growing on a piece of wood. It's sort of buried under the grass there, but there is a piece of wood underneath which it's growing on. And so we expect to see more of this, obviously, over time as the wood becomes more established. So it's great news actually to see more of this, because this was never here before. There's obviously, this is a direct result of us coppicing and producing these nice stacks of dead around the edge as well. So this is great. And lastly, oh no, not lastly, there's the toad. So we have lots of toads starting to appear, and we've found quite a few baby ones last year, didn't we? Which was quite exciting.
So they like to live in the bottom of the dead hedge where they've got some cover from predators.
Yeah. So the last thing is the rides, which are big corridors you find through the wood. These are a stable open area. These are never included as part of the coops, but they provide a corridor between the coops for the flora and fauna to move through. So as you cut the areas, you've got these corridors for them to move from one area to another. So that's quite an important feature of coppice woodlands, as well as the rides that you have growing through it. So there we go. That's I've got some that's biodiversity, sort of in a very brief nutshell. I don't know if there's any questions jumping out of that just now, or if you want to.
So I've just got one question, which I think is going to be covered by a few things. So Becky had asked, when you coppice, do you leave the cut wood in a woodland as a source of dead wood, or in a dead hedge? And I guess you're going to talk a little bit about some of your management, and also a little bit about actually some of the timber products that you take out of the woodland, aren't you?
Yes, that's coming on to that next. Okay.
Well spotted, Becky.
Well, it's a bit of when first, a bit of history.
Yeah, so a bit we thought we'd do the when. So obviously there's two whens. The first one is, when do you do it? So the main time for coppicing is in the dormant period. So it's after leaf drop, right through till really early spring. So we always like to have finished our coppicing by the end of March.
And there's another reason for that, talking of biodiversity, is because you want to avoid the nesting season. So you need to be stopped before that all comes into play as well.
So if we're taking any mature trees down in the wood as well, we tend to do that at this time of year. All right. The only proviso on that is if you want to coppice an ornamental shrub, then really you need to find out what the shrub is and find out when the best time of pruning that is. So you may need to coppice it after flower or something like that. Often it's done because the thing's got humongous, like a really giant Philadelphus, and you need to fight your way to the shed. So if you do that after flower in the summer, then it's really successful. We have done it in the winter and it will regrow, but sometimes you can do it in the end after it's flowered in the summer, and then leave it for 3 years and then do it again. So you lose one cycle of flowers, but it works. Okay, so we thought we'd talk, because we've been talking about ancient woodlands and things, we'd talk about a little bit about what the history of coppicing. What we've tried to do through this webinar is only use our own pictures or videos. So instead of pinching ones of archaeological digs and things, we're book bookworms. So we thought we'd show you a few books. So the first bit of information we know about the use of coppice woodlands is from this, which is the Sweet Track of Glastonbury. And this is in Neolithic times, and it's where, can you see that? Sorry. Yeah, you can see that. And it's basically, they found this trackway, wooden trackway. The Romans have always been credited for building roads in Britain, but there's a lot of roads here before them. And they realized the only way they could have built this trackway is by they had a coppice management system in place to provide enough of the size timber they used in the trackway. Okay, and then our next one, moving closer to Scotland. Scotland and Ireland is particularly known for its crannogs, and crannogs are basically roundhouses built on water. So they tend to either built on piers or built on brushwood. And there's a lot of evidence that coppice wood was used either in a lot of the sides, a lot of the walls are made of hurdles. So they use coppice wood in the hurdles. And on this site, this one is in Dumfries and Galloway down near Stranraer, there's evidence of coppice wood being turned into charcoal for metal working. So an early use of coppice wood is charcoal, which is for bronze work in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. All right, we know what we got. And then we move to medieval times. There's a lot. That's when we've got a lot more written evidence of what's going on in woods. So the big one in England was the Domesday Book, because William the Conqueror wanted to know what he had, because you could tax everything, as you know. So he wanted to know what he could tax, what was he going to earn money from. So if a knight owned a woodland, what earnings was he going to get from that woodland? How much was he charging for someone to put their pigs in it so that he could make a cut of that? And closer to home, this is the Clyde. This is a really interesting document found, which is the preliminary history of the Clyde Valley woodlands. This was a major project looking at what the woodlands around the River Clyde were used for, and there was evidence of coppice wood on the Craig near Craignethan Castle, and the woodland was owned by, I think it was Melrose Abbey, so they ordered wood from this area to be taken down for Melrose for repairs of the abbey. And there's also alder that had been cut. Alder is brilliant wood for coppice wood. The charcoal reaches really high temperatures, so you can use it for iron working, but you can also for making gunpowder, which it was when sort of guns started getting used. From a biodiversity point of view, the ancient woodlands are really good. It's because the folks used every tree in the wood. They weren't selective, so you had quite a diverse wood. What happened in the 18th century is that folks realized that some woods were more valuable to them at that time. So in the west coast of Scotland, a lot of oak was coppiced for the tanning industry, because they stripped the bark off the oak and he used it as a way of tanning leather. And so that happened in Scotland. Well, in southern England, there was large areas planted with hazel, sweet chestnut, and willow.
So it's more monoculture.
So it's more of what we call a monoculture. Monoculture is one plant, so it's a bit more like a Sitka woodland, where it's only got one tree in it. And in the 19th century, there was a major decline in the use of coppice woodlands, because they realised that you could smelt iron using coke and coal rather than using charcoal. So there was a big decline in its use. Present management, we've got a bit of a increase in the use of coppice woodlands. I'm going to show you a photo picture. Here we go. So this is an estate not far up the road from me in South Lanarkshire, Carmichael Estate, and they're growing willow on really short rotation. So it's only about 3 years old, and it's grown in rows like this, and it's harvested with a really expensive machine, and it's used for biomass. So the stems are chipped, dried, and then burnt. So either this can be for community heating projects, or it's also used at Lockerbie Power Station to produce electrical energy. Okay, another form of coppicing that the Forestry Commission are researching is what they call short rotation forestry, where they're growing hybrids of poplar trees for 10 years in rows, and then harvesting using a harvester. And that's going into the main drive at the moment for timber production in Britain really is biomass. So you may have noticed when you're traveling through the country, the areas of Sitka plantation you saw that were half fallen over, half dead, they've disappeared because suddenly that's worth money. Well, it wasn't worth producing it before, worth harvesting before. And willow and sweet chestnut and hazel are still grown in southern Britain for the basket industry. And as Amy mentioned, there's a lot of amenity value in coppice woodlands as well. So they're managed for that point of view and for habitat.
Yeah, so habitats have become a product almost. It's the reason that some stuff coppicing's being done in many woods. It's usually managed by trusts and charities.
Yeah.
So products, have a quick look.
Yeah, have a quick look at products.
Because I realise the time's running on. So
yeah, I know.
Quick run through.
So have a quick look at products. What can you get out of your coppice woodland?
Okay, yeah, I'll find it. Where's the picture? There you go.
Here we go. So this is a notice at Bradfield Wood, we just seen earlier, and this is some of the produce that they sell every year from their coppice. And you'll notice that the stuff that is sold out is the loads of firewood at the bottom there. Okay, so one of the major products of coppice wood is firewood, but also you've got traditional stuff like hedge and stakes, and pea sticks and hazel rods for hurdles and things as well. And also right at the bottom there, you've got this soil improver. So there's been a lot of research into char, which is like the byproduct of charcoal production. And talking of charcoal production, oh, sorry, this is our wood at Stoneheap Wood, and what you see here is the traditional cord. So what we do when we've cut the trees, we stack it in lengths on these frames, and traditionally these were like 4 foot by 4 foot by 8 foot long, and they were called cords, and you bought your wood in a cord rather than buying it by the ton, because you can imagine a ton of dry willow weighs a lot less than a ton of dry, in volume is different from a ton of elm, say, which is quite heavy wood. Okay, and sorry, what we're going to go is some charcoal. So traditionally this is used for metalworking, but it's still now produced in quite large quantities for barbecues.
And then we're looking at the.
And then we're looking at, this is one of my favourite places. This is Westow in Suffolk, and they did an archaeological dig here and found a Saxon village. So they decided to rebuild the houses to see how well they would how well they would last. And all the framing from here would have come from Coppicing standard wood. So you need the bigger trees to make your frames for your houses, and the boards would have been cleaved out of these bigger trees. And
yep.
Okay. So we mentioned sweet chestnut and for fencing and things like that. In Scotland, there was the use of fodder, using coppice wood for fodder. So that means particularly pollards is where you'd cut the young foliage off in August and then feed it to your animals. And that is still done in Hungary, and they call it thrashing. A recent use of woodlands, let alone coppice woodlands, is foraging, where you're going in and trying to find edible and medicinal plants. And obviously the coppice, what it allows is that green, that flora to the ground vegetation to grow, and that's where a lot of this foraging comes from. And you get your fungi as well. So I think the scarlet elf cup, some of its relatives are edible. and you can use it for green woodwork and turning. We've got a few products here that you might like. Some of them are very
quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. We said we do like reenactment, so obviously you do one sort of favourite little hobby would be make spears. Spears, ash, traditionally made of ash, and there's loads of poetry in the sagas. They mention ash used for even cool spears by ash, and things are more to be probably seen yourself is like axe handles. Before we got cheap imports from America, agree, most of our tool handles were ash, and it all comes out of this small wood. You don't need huge trees to produce this sort of size timber. So this can come out of a quarter of your tree, and a lot of old axe heads are found, instead of being an oval shape, they're slightly wedge shaped, and I think it's because they're fitting a wedge shaped piece of wood to it. And we have stuff you get out of your birchwood. If you're going to do some Harry Potter, you need your biz and broom. And something I used to wear years ago, not particularly these are obviously a souvenir from Holland, is your clogs, which were made out of willow or poplar. I used to work in a wine cellar when I was 18. I wore wooden clogs, which were leather uppers and wooden soles, which came from Marvenroyd in Yorkshire. Turning wise, these are from older wood, out of a wood. So if you're talking about more older coppice, sort of if you went up, if you let your woods go to about 28 years old, you could certainly get timber big enough to turn out of. So if you're doing,
just do the stool, man, Micah.
Pardon?
The stool.
If you're doing smaller stuff,
yeah,
these are spindles for drop spindles for spinning wool and spinning yarn, and these were turned out of ash and oak.
Right, got a huge quantity down there, but probably just the stool.
What do you think? And a stool?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. We've got a lot of furniture.
Okay, you can go on things like courses and things. But what's really good nowadays is you can go on courses and learn how to make this stuff, so you can see where your wood's coming from and then go and have a play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
okay.
That
so this goes on.
Sums up. Yeah, there's quite a lot there, but we'll stop at that point. And what next? So we're looking at, there's loads of books if you're interested in coppicing. So we're talking about Ben Law earlier, who's a real expert on this. He's lives in this wood with it all. And this is his first book, The Woodland Way, which is absolutely fantastic. But he does have other books as well, which if you look him up, you can see. And they're available for sale. We've also got, we'll start with the history, Oliver Rackham. It's very good with the history of it. It covers a lot. He used Bradfield Wood as an example for a lot of what he's talked about. If you're interested in the history of British woodland, then that's a good one to be looking at. Pruning, if more specifically on the pruning front, this is the RHS book of pruning. It covers a lot of plants, which you'll find it does include coppicing techniques as well. So that's worth looking at. And when it comes to practical hands-on stuff, you've got the TCV Woodlands Handbook. Fantastic, really clear drawings, an excellent book. I can't recommend it enough. And it has also got other chapters within it on biodiversity and products as well, which is great. It's a very, very good hands-on book. And another one with lots of good ideas, particularly if you're thinking of maybe running it as a business. And that's Coppicing and Crafts. And that's by Rebecca Oakes and Edward Mills. So that's a really good one to be looking at. And for biodiversity, there is actually a PDF online. We can't get hold of it to buy it, but you can find it for free online. And that is Coppice Woodlands, Their Management for Wildlife by Fuller and Warren. Came out in '93. So if you're interested in the biodiversity side of it specifically, that is absolutely number one on your list. You really need to get a hold of this, but that's available online. Okay, that's the only place we could find it. So that's a brief rundown of some books, and I know there's loads out there, but those are the ones we found useful. And in terms of courses, usually we run a one-day introduction to coppicing at Stoneheap Wood. Obviously, we've not been able to last year, and I'm not sure this year we might be able to. We don't know yet. And there's other places that offer these one-day sort of taster courses as well, in Scotland and elsewhere. But there's also a 3-year apprenticeship, which is run usually, presumably this is stopped as well, by the Bill Hogarth Memorial Apprenticeship Trust down in Cumbria. And this is a 3-year apprenticeship for 2 people each year. So it's not very many people. The competition's probably quite stiff. And this is to secure the tradition of coppicing. And that's it, she said. God, we overrun a little bit. I'm really sorry. I think we're ready.
Don't apologise. People are very welcome to mooch off in their own time.
I know.
And, you know, I try and find people who are passionate about the subject, and this is inevitably what happens. So really, don't apologise. You know, I was so happy to hear you guys talking about the thrashing, the use of techniques for fodder, because what I do when I'm not working with rivers is that I'm a soil ecologist, and one of the things that I'm really interested in is the use of anthelmintics, so deworming medications for cattle, and we've taken a lot of trees historically out of some of our grazing pastures, and putting things back in such as willow and oak and such actually creates tannins, and so people don't have to use as many anthelmintics in their creatures, which means that you then get better. Well, those drugs carry over into soil, and we lose our soil fauna because it poisons them and stops them developing in the soil. So I've been really kind of encouraging people to put trees back into their woodlands so that we can have dung beetles again. You know? So I've got a few last questions from people. So Joanne asks, there's a lot of talk of campaigning at the moment about Scotland becoming a rewilding nation. Do you think that coppicing has a part to play in that strategy?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I think
talking about that.
Rewilding is a bit weird because a lot of people then talk about wolves and, you know, predators and things like that, which I'm up for. We may lose a few children while doing that, but you know, are humans the most, you know, most important creature on Earth? That's a very debatable subject. But yeah, I think it is, because I think any woodland and any form is good news to me, you know, whether it's coppiced or not. You know, we're passionate about coppice woodlands, but we're passionate about all woodlands because, yeah, because of our diversity. So yeah, we'll have a part to play in that.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And someone, Alan, who manages to coppice down in I think he was saying Bolton, is saying that, you know, it's been such a historical practice as well, that, you know, if we're thinking back to humans being part of the ecosystem and how do we fit into that, you know, I think there has to be this not entirely Puritan idea of rewilding where everything is unmanaged and absolutely no touching. In fact, actually, we should go back to some of our sort of very nature-driven ways of actually harvesting in a natural fashion. So I could see coppicing having a really good play in that.
Yeah.
And there's another question from Rob who says, how does coppicing ask the riparian areas with regards to water temperature? So we have a project where we called Cool Rivers, which is such a 90s named project, which is about trying to get riparian woodlands in. And I totally think that coppicing is part of that. In a lot of countries such as Holland and things like that, you see riparian trees being used and managed in this fashion a lot. We just have this nature where we say, oh, it's a buffer zone, and we just leave it to be unmanaged, I think, for riparian areas. And I think that's just to say, because you have a, you know, section of riverbank that's your land, doesn't mean you can't manage on that, and you can't still generate the benefits for the river by including that as well. And then we also have, I know we have Annie, who's a local artist on, and she uses charcoal a lot in some of her teaching. So she was asking, do you ever make the charcoal while the wood is still green?
Yes, and we've made artist charcoal as well. So we have done that. So we get tins and we fill it. We get the willow green and we cut it and take the bark off and we pop it into the tins. And yeah, we did that with a project. Didn't we? And
it dries really quick.
Yeah.
I probably would let it dry a bit.
Mm.
You know, yeah, it wasn't straight off the tree. But but we've certainly done it as projects with groups.
Mhm.
We've worked with a mental health charity in the wood, which is just, you know, that's one thing, is the human side of woods, is the biophilia side of it, is people feel better when they're outside, you know, and in woods is even better.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes
because
sense.
you can have your enclosed space and the rest of it. So we're doing charcoal burning with that, and so they then used the charcoal. We did 2 lots. We did the main bulk was older, but we also had a tin of willow. So the older we then did some cooking, and with the willow they then did a lot of drawing.
Yeah, so we did leaf rubbing and they did some drawing as well, and produced some really nice spots. Yeah, good
That's
pictures.
wonderful.
Yeah.
And I've got one last question from Wendy, who asks, do you ever grow anything that's an evergreen?
Which is evergreen. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We have holly, and we have tried planting yew in the wood, and partly it was I thought that deer might not eat it. Wrong. They love it. So that was a learning curve. They actually munched the holly as well, but we do have some, and we also have Scots pine growing through that was planted originally in the wood before we came, and we try and keep that. It's obviously doing better in lighter areas where there's more light. They do better rather than the actual center of the wood, and where they're doing well, we're keeping it produced, because the evergreen, especially the large evergreen trees, they're great for roosting for the buzzards and big birds. They come and sit in them. So that's quite good. It's good to have a bit of everything.
Yeah. Basically, most conifers don't coppice.
They don't coppice, no, but the holly does.
The holly, you can coppice holly, and so it's a way of controlling its size in a garden, because they can get quite large trees. And you will as well, but things like Scots pine don't, so we wouldn't think about coppicing them.
No, but it's a good standard tree.
Yeah, and it's just beautiful. Really nice orange bark. It's great.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it. So I've put a last call out for questions, but we don't have anything so far. So all I can want to say is thank you so much for this tonight, guys. It was wonderful.
Right.
I really enjoyed it. I've got lots of comments coming in that people saying that they really enjoyed it, that this is something that they've been looking at, and that this has just provided them with so much information and points to go off on. And we've got a load of the reading list that you have, I'm going to put together, and there's some other links that people have shared. So I'll put this all out in an email to people.
Yeah, and we'll email you the Brasenose.
Yeah, brilliant. And what I'll do as well, Amy and Micah very kindly suggested that I can share their email address as well. So feel free, I'll send an email out, hopefully tomorrow, see what my emails look like tomorrow, and see if I can get through that.
Yeah.
And I'll get that out to you. And I guess that's everything really. But yeah, thank you very much. This is actually our last talk in our mini series of chit chats. I can't believe how many people we've had tonight. That's been excellent. So yeah, we might do some more. I will have a look, but yeah, thank you so much. And obviously, Amy and Micah, you're having to do this on your own. Normally you'd get some willing volunteers who may not always prune to the best, but I'm sure you'd be looking for some volunteers, hopefully this year, if we're allowed to get out. So
yeah, that'd be super. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming and listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Thank you. Bye now.
Still.
Do we still?
Yeah, we'll just hang about for a second.
Yeah.
So that was a total of